The history of political violence in this country is not a Democrat story. That is factually inaccurate.
It is in the last 5 years.
No, it is in the last 1 year. One, single. Okay, this year, 2025, is the first and only year in the last 20 years where left-wing violence has exceeded right-wing violence. That is a fact. In the last 5 years, it's been 4 years, it's right-wing violence, 1 year, left-wing violence.
This clip is from about a month ago, but the topic of so-called political violence is still very relevant. The show is called Table for Five, and it's hosted by Abby Phillip on CNN. So where are these incidents of left-wing violence she's talking about? Well, there's a study from the Center for Strategic and International Studies going around that multiple publications have covered, and that's probably what she's referring to. I'm starting with this NBC News article about the study, published September 25th, 2025. It says, the number of right-wing terror attacks in the U.S. plunged dramatically in the first half of 2025, while the amount of political violence from the left creeped up. This is apparently the first time in 30 years that left-wing violence has exceeded right-wing violence. 1995 must have been some year.
Fire!
According to the study, only one right-wing act of terrorism took place in the first half of this year. The Minneapolis shooting of Democratic Farmer Labor Party State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette, who were injured but survived, and DFLP State Rep Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, who did not survive. This was first reported as a left-wing attack by Republican Congressman Mike Lee of Utah, roughly 2 seconds after news of the shooting became public. This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way. So, of course, plenty of right-wingers ran with that and have never deviated. But it turned out that the guy was a Republican with a hit list of Minnesota Democrats.
Police say they found what appears to be a hit list with dozens of names in his car. Officials say the list included prominent lawmakers like Representative Ilhan Omar, Senator Tina Smith, and pro-abortion rights advocates. Flyers for anti-Trump protests were also said to be found. According to video and social media posts reviewed by CNN, Belcher is an outspoken evangelical Christian and was critical of LGBTQ rights.
But don't let facts get in the way of your story. It's also important to keep in mind that terms like the left, or even Marxists, socialists, communists, etc., have ever-changing definitions in how the right uses them. It can mean anything from standard Democrat voters to Nancy Pelosi to DSA to revolutionary communists to the crustiest anarchist you ever did see. And when Democrats, which Abby Phillip likely is, partially concede to Republican framing, as she did in the clip, it does no favors for the Democrats, and most of all, it puts a target on the real left, socialists, communists, etc. Because liberals will, at least 99% of the time, distance themselves from the left and either enable or join the fascist repression of the left. But I say to liberals, no matter how much you acquiesce to the right, no matter how much of a good little anti-communist soldier you are, you will never be safe from them. Again, they call Nancy Pelosi a communist too. Another incident that comes up is Charlie Kirk. In this case, it at least seems more likely that a left-leaning person would do him in, but the story still doesn't hold up. Governor Spencer Cox of Utah, where of course the shooting took place, said Robinson was a, quote, very normal young man who later developed a, quote, leftist ideology after appearing to become increasingly radicalized in recent years. Now, in my experience, when Republicans say normal, they mean white, Christian, conservative, cishet males. And anyone who deviates whatsoever from that so-called norm is political. Here, Cox said radicalized, but a lot of outlets have used that term interchangeably with political. Al Jazeera, among others, said he, quote, had turned political recently, paraphrasing a description of Robinson given by an unnamed family member. Remember, anything outside the norm, according to conservatives, is political. So again, as far as we know, this quote is in reference to Robinson apparently coming to the belief that gay and trans people are human beings who deserve respect. He may have been dating a trans person, which the right were quick to point to as evidence that he's a leftist and a product of the violent leftist movement. By the way, if you don't know the kind of stereotype about conservative men And trans women, just ask any trans woman to tell you about the private messages on one of their social medias. The topic of minority rights, civil rights, social justice, whatever you want to call it, is a leftist value, even a liberal value, I guess. So yeah, at least on this issue, he was on the left, or at least left-leaning, because we don't have the specifics. And I'll grant that while I don't trust the FBI, especially not the people currently in charge of it, and I don't know if he actually wrote these things on the bullet casings, but if Robinson really wrote, "Hey, fascist catch," and "Bella Ciao" on the bullet casings, those are leftist coded phrases. It's weird that he supposedly also wrote, "If you read this, you're gay," if he really was pro-LGBTQ. You're gay! You're gay! You're gay! But you got 2 out of 3. So he's pro-LGBTQ. And first of all, he's from a Christian, conservative, Republican family in the highly religious, highly conservative red state of Utah. His family seemed to be steeped in gun culture, and Robinson's social media history suggests he was too. I know he is said to have butted heads with his family over trans rights, or at least the idea of him dating a trans person, but we just don't know how he identified politically. He was a registered independent and did not vote in either of the past 2 general elections. And before that, he was not old enough to vote yet. Remember that Dick Cheney, vice president of the administration that floated the idea of a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage, later became pro-gay marriage, or at least in favor of allowing states to legalize it, solely because his daughter, Mary, is a lesbian. If you think Dick Cheney was a leftist, I want some of whatever you're smoking. Additionally, if you read the texts and forum messages they released, you'll see that no one in Robinson's circle wanted him to off Charlie Kirk. His online friends said, "Hey man, don't do that." Then after he did it, they were like, "Why did you do that?" The trans roommate and or partner was also horrified that he had done this, and immediately cooperated with the FBI. So where does the leftist hate-fueled violence come in? Where's the manifesto saying how the rhetoric of Hassan Piker and Sam Cedar drove him to do this? Where are his social media posts and private messages about all the other leftist causes he supports, among all the photos we do have of him holding guns? Was he a big Medicare for All guy? Public housing? Did he read a lot of Marx? Was he a member of DSA or PSL or RCA? Where's the fucking narrative? It falls apart instantly. Another named incident in the article is Luigi Mangione's alleged shooting of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. And yes, I use the correct Italian pronunciation of Mangione to honor my heritage. Y'all can keep saying Mangione if you want, but I'm sticking with Mangione. Maron. Anyway, I maintain that Luigi is innocent, but that's another story. The crazy thing is that the study actually counts this as an incident of left-wing violence. Meanwhile, Luigi seems to be some kind of radical centrist with an incoherent mix of beliefs, which seems to be true of most of these guys, including both Trump shooters and, I suspect, most Americans. No shade to my fellow Americans, but our education and media keep us in the dark about the true nature of ideology.
It's pure ideology.
Consequently, we tend not to have a good idea of where ideas and policies fall on the political spectrum, which is likely why we're having this silly conversation about so-called political violence. So Luigi is a centrist, and when it comes to Brian Thompson, more so than the subject of any other such high-profile attack, just about every person, left, right, and center, in this fading republic said, "Good. Fuck 'em." Tell me again how this fits some pattern of left-wing violence. We didn't say, kill the CEOs. We said Medicare for all. Leftists, as in socialists and communists, also have warned you that if you don't do things like Medicare for all, people are going to come for the CEOs. We are not encouraging violence, and we're not advocating for it. We are analyzing history and current conditions and alerting you that the chemical reaction you're working with is highly volatile and you have to change the balance or it's going to explode. And what do you know? That's exactly what happened. This shit happens because people across the political spectrum are suffering. I don't think you want to see what happens when people have nothing left to lose. Even Mao Zedong didn't encourage violence, whatever else you think of him. For all the idle talk online about Mao offing landlords, this is not exactly what happened. When the Communist Party started enacting land reform, they asked landlords to give their land to the peasants without any trouble, at which point the former landlords could become peasants or workers themselves. When some landlords refused, the peasants did away with them.
We were told to get together and ask the landlords to return land to us. We stated how much they should return and how they should return it. There was a denunciation meeting every day.
It's just what happens when you treat people like animals for long enough. And I hope you've noticed that I'm not just flipping the script and blaming the right for all the violence. I certainly think more violence comes from the right, and their rhetoric is much more geared towards hatred and fear of the other, but I honestly just don't put a lot of stock in random, non-state violence. Organized factional violence is a little different. I can think of 3 times in just the past decade when organized right-wing militias occupied or tried to occupy state and federal buildings with hostile intent. In 2016, the Bundy family occupied the headquarters of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Burns, Oregon, because they didn't want to pay grazing fees for their cattle. This was part of a larger standoff with the U.S. government that involved several right-wing militias, including the Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, Praetorian Guard, White Mountain Militia, and the Missouri Citizens Militia. That's a lot of fucking militias. Militia Joan Hart up in here. I bet they were watching Militia Benoist and blasting some Militia Etheridge, more like Militia Ruby. In 2020, the FBI thwarted a plot by 14 people, interesting number, to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer over the state's stay-at-home orders during the first year of the pandemic, which is still happening, by the way. About half the people in this group were members of a militia called Wolverine Watchmen, which is so fucking lame. Then, of course, there was January 6th, 2021. Farewell to my comment section. But again, I think small-scale acts of violence are the result of basically a chemical reaction or our material conditions. I condemn the right's hostility when it happens, but the right simply understands that politics is a violent game. I'll leave it at that. However, for the purposes of this video, I'm much more interested in state violence. State violence sets the standard of violence. The U.S. is the largest producer and exporter of weapons in the world and has been at war in some form or another for almost its entire history.
Guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The same goes for imperial conquest of foreign lands for resources and corporate profit. The CIA has been involved in weapons and drug trafficking since at least the 1980s. With this kind of history and present, how is anyone surprised that the US population is plagued with drugs and violence? Same question when it comes to victims of our foreign policy. Invade the land, steal the resources, kill, torture, and rape. Cry terrorism when the natives fight back, and say you had no choice but to commit genocide. Sound familiar? It's certainly worth keeping tabs on violent acts, who carries them out, and who the victims are, but the back-and-forth scorekeeping is unproductive. This guy's a leftist. This guy shot a Democrat. Oh, this guy only shoots circus clowns. It's a distraction. Real political violence is state violence, and U.S. state violence is right-wing. I'm not just saying that. From 1945 until the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, a huge part of the mandate of U.S. domestic and foreign policy was anti-communism. And to this day, we're still working to undermine leftist movements and seize resources for the capitalists. People think you're some crazy conspiracy theorist when you say this, but the U.S. stepped in to crush communist movements around the world, and even places that tried any social democratic reform. unless it was in Europe. This is just history. What do you think the US military and CIA were doing in Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, much of South and Central America, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, Afghanistan, and more? Shore leave? This happened under Democrats and Republicans because both parties are right-wing. Both parties are anti-communist. The Korean War lasted from 1950 to 1953, started under Truman, a Democrat, ended under Eisenhower, a Republican, who was then the first to deploy troops to Southeast Asia in 1955. The Vietnam War continued under Kennedy, a Democrat, and the worst of it took place under Johnson, a Democrat, and Nixon, a Republican. Also, don't forget the House Un-American Activities Committee, which blacklisted many Hollywood actors and ruined many lives, and bills like the Communist Control Act, which essentially banned communists from serving in government. It passed with flying colors, red and blue. Keep in mind, there was never a Fascist Control Act. Is state violence always right-wing? Of course not. I consider places like the Soviet Union, however complicated it was, to be left-wing, and they committed their share of violence. I would say China is left-wing in many ways, and it's not like they're a pacifist country. But it's worth noting that China has not invaded or bombed another country in decades. What's the last country Cuba went to war with? Or Colombia? Bolivia? Vietnam? North Korea, for that matter? Regarding the domestic and foreign policy of these nations, the number of conflicts and the amount and severity of the violence is simply not comparable to the US. Again, even if we're talking about huge world powers like China or the USSR. Ultimately, I don't care as much about your tactics as I do your goals. The left's goal is a world that prioritizes people over profits. The right's goal is just the opposite, and we're living in the consequences now. This charge of political violence is another thought-terminating cliche from the ruling class in this country, and its only purpose, at the end of the day, is to serve as a cudgel against the left. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and if you can, help us out on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Bye now.